Hi, everyone. Welcome to part B of the lecture for this week. So the first lecture was presented by Dr. Graham Burke, and I will be presenting part B of this lecture series. So this section of the lecture will be going over the idea of perspectives in history, which we know to be both a concept and a skill. So I'm preparing this lecture for 2 units. So it's being prepared for those of you in the primary history unit, and also those of you in the secondary history unit. And the reason for this is because both units are looking at perspectives in history this week. And secondly, my reason for doubling up the lecture for both groups is because I do think, and I have expressed this before, I do think that it's not a bad idea to know what teachers in other year levels are doing in the subject as well. There will be one section of the lecture that is particularly relevant to those of you who are going to be secondary history teachers, and I will let those of you in the primary unit know beforehand so that you can end the lecture at that point, or you're welcome to continue as well. So there will be some specific examples that I use that are more relevant to primary teachers and some that are more relevant to secondary. So I ask you just to think of what the broad idea is of what I'm trying to show you, and I'll make it relevant for both groups though. So the readings for this week are a little bit different for both groups. So those of you who are in the primary unit will be just looking at the first reading from the Gilbert textbook. Those of you who are in the secondary unit will be looking at all 4 readings on the screen here. So the Gilbert reading, in addition to that, you will also be reading 3 chapters from the Sharp textbook, where we look more specifically at the cross-curriculum priorities in history. So those of you who are in the primary unit, I will talk a little bit about these towards the end of this lecture, and that will be the point where you can end the lecture or you can continue on, because it is relevant to those of you teaching primary students as well. But the examples that I use will be specific to secondary history. So before we go on to the next slide, I'll just say that many of you will have noticed that in the history syllabus, the word perspectives comes up quite a bit. And you'll also probably have noticed that perspectives is both a skill and a concept. So we know that skills are these things that we need students to be developing as they proceed through learning history. And we also know that concepts are those words that we need students to come to understand while they're going through the content. So we can think of skills as like an action that students are doing. They're doing something in the classroom to develop that skill. And the concepts are these abstract ideas that students need to come to understand. So how different are they? And what does it all mean when we have this different approach to understanding it as a concept and also as a skill that we need to be developing in students? What does that mean, and why are they different anyways? All right, so as we look at this slide here, we can see that perspectives is both a concept and a skill, as stated before. So in early stage 1, we need students to understand the concept of perspectives through an exploration of a point of view and understanding that stories may vary depending on who is the narrator. But as a skill, we actually need them to be engaged in the unit of work by exploring a point of view. And you can see that it's quite similar, really. They're exploring a point of view, okay? So they're actually doing that in the classroom, but they also need to understand that the point of view can be different depending on who the narrator is, okay? So they kind of go together. They're both working together in a way. Now, if we go down to stage 3, we need students to understand that there are different points of view in the past and the present. But the skill is that students are actually being able to identify that there are different points of view. So they both need to be able to identify and also understand different points of view. Okay, so that's quite different. Identifying is different from understanding it, although you can't really understand it unless you identify it, right? So if we go on to stage 4, so in stage 4, students need to understand that there are different perspectives of participants in a particular historical context, but the skill is that students are actually identifying and describing it. So remember that understanding of different perspectives, but also the action of identifying it. Okay, so a lot of identification in this skill of perspectives. Okay, that's really important there. It's not just understanding it, but also identification. And in stage 4 and 5, they're also describing and analyzing as well. Okay, but as you can see, that identification comes through in stage 2. Okay, so taking note of that cognitive verb there, exploration, identification. Okay, but the concept is basically, as I said, it's that abstract idea that we need students to understand, and we need them to understand different perspectives, different points of view in a historical context. Okay, now there's actually a pretty good website that I'm going to show you in a moment. And on that website, I actually came across an article written by, I can't remember the author's name at the moment, but I will upload this article for each of you to read through. It is 17 pages long, so I'm going to briefly go over some of the main points that came through, which made me want to talk about this in this lecture. So the concept of perspectives and also the skill, because I do think it can be quite confusing. I'm sure many of you looked through the syllabus and thought, wow, it's a concept, but it's also a skill. How is that? Why is that? Why are they both there in both those different continuum tables, and how are they different? So that's what I wanted to address here, because that's what we're looking at this week, different perspectives. So I'll just take you out of the PowerPoint and show you the website and also the article. Okay, so this is the website. It's historyskills.com. Feel free to come and explore. In particular, after this unit is finished, you can come in here and have a look anytime you want. I'm going to show you one video that's on here to show you how good it can be. Now, a lot of it is probably more geared towards secondary, but you may find it useful, even those of you who are in the primary unit, because it goes over quite a bit of information that you may find helpful. So analyzing sources, okay, and evaluating sources, also conducting research, which students need to do right from early stage 1. So, and also historical knowledge. So what does it all mean? What does significance mean? What does it mean when we say change and continuity? Okay, so this, you could find a quite useful site. Now, the article is this one here, and it's called "The Problem of Perspective in the History Classroom. We Cannot Seem to Agree on What It Means." So I'm going to go over a few points that are made by the author, okay? And but you're welcome to come and have a look at this article on your own, because I find it quite interesting and very relevant to what we're talking about this week. So going back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so the article basically goes on to say that there is disagreement between teachers about what perspectives are, and also the practice of teaching perspectives. So the author of this article actually offers 4 different options and interpretations of how historical perspective is explained. Okay, so overall, teachers explain perspective in the following 4 ways. So the first one, it's explained as the ideas expressed in a source. So what this means is that we're looking at the words in a source, and students are expected to guess what authors' beliefs are based on the images or the words that are presented. Okay, so that's kind of looking at source analysis there. Option 2, historical perspective is explained by some teachers as the background of the source creator. So rather than looking at the words or the image that's presented, we're looking at the author's actual background. So what was the author's profession? What was the author's political affiliation? What was the author's nationality? And the Queensland syllabus actually states that age, gender, and social position are also indicators of what one's perspective would be. And this is the one that students often go to. This is what the author says of this article. The other option is that it's explained as acknowledging that people in the past thought differently to us. And that is demonstrating an empathetic reading of how people in the past express their ideas. So we can kind of put ourselves in that person's shoes to understand that different opinion or different perspective. Option 4, historical perspective, is explained as the elements that contributed to the creation of the source. So why was it created? Who was the audience intended to be? And what was the purpose of actually creating it? Or it might be that some teachers believe in a couple of these or all of them. So the next 2 slides go through what the author says, or sort of dismantling a couple of these. So in the first instance, the author sort of dismantles the idea that explanation 1 should be how we can explain historical perspective, because the author actually states that the ideas expressed in a source is actually thinking about comprehension and interpretation, okay? And you can go on and read the article to see what the author means is in that way. Explanation 3, the author sort of dismantles that, saying that's more historical empathy. So thinking about how others thought differently to us, that's being empathetic. It's not really looking at perspective, it's being empathetic, okay? And number 4, the author says this is more source analysis, which is not necessarily attributed to perspective. Well, so, I mean, these may or may not be true. This is just what the author's saying. But what I'm trying to show you here is that the author is actually zooming in on the idea that understanding what perspective looks like in the classroom is not necessarily clear. Okay, so we may or may not agree with what this author is saying, but I think the main point here is that not everybody thinks the same about what perspective is, which kind of goes with what the word actually means. But so this author is actually saying that number 2 is the better explanation. It's the most accurate because it's not aligned with anything else. Whereas the other ones kind of were more attributed, the author says, to comprehension or empathy or source analysis. So I'm not sure exactly how I feel about this. I would like to know what your opinion is so far on what this is saying. I would actually probably agree that source analysis is very important to perspectives, because in order to understand the perspective of any source, so if we're looking at any source, we really need to we're analyzing a source to be able to do that. Otherwise, how do we know what the perspectives are? So we need to remember that there are perspectives of the past and there are perspectives on the past. So interestingly, I thought this was a good point that was brought up by the author of this article. The author states that the Victorian syllabus actually states that only primary sources are the ones that include historical perspectives, while interpretations are used when discussing the view of secondary sources. Do you agree with that? So have a think about that. Primary sources are the only ones with historical perspectives, and secondary sources are interpretations. So I do think that there is a connection between perspectives and the use of sources, because we can't really identify perspectives, points of view, unless we actually look at sources. Okay, so this is more of a source used in secondary school. Okay, but I thought it was quite good to share with you. A lot of this stuff comes from this website, so I put the reference there. So we know that source analysis is also a skill. Okay, that's the one that I often talk about being quite difficult to teach to students. It's the one that I really struggled with. So we know that that's also a skill. So what I'm saying is that I think that perspective is connected to source analysis. So I guess I'm kind of disagreeing a little bit with what the author said, but I can also see the author's point about there being such confusion between what we're actually asking students to do when we're asking them to identify a point of view. So for example, here, if we're looking at source analysis, what a student would do would be identifying whether it's a primary, secondary source, and this is actually happening in primary school as well. Okay, so not just secondary school. So this would be the evidence from the source that the students are looking at, and then from that source, we need to be getting students to actually analyze it. Okay, so obviously this is a little bit for more like the upper years in high school, but primary school, we're doing the same thing. So we're trying to figure out where the source came from, who wrote the source, when it was written, what it tells us, and whether it's a useful or accurate source. And I'll go over that in a moment. So I want to just show you a video from the History Skills website. So this video is looking at how do you determine a source's perspective.
When you need to analyze a historical source, being able to successfully identify the perspective of the source's creator is incredibly handy. In particular, discovering the perspective allows you to draw conclusions about a source's reliability and usefulness to your research task or classwork. So what is perspective? Perspective, simply put, is the point of view from which the creator of a source describes historical events. In other words, is how a person sees the world around them. Everyone sees and understands historical events differently depending on a range of factors, including their age, gender, social position, beliefs, and values. Let's take an example. Imagine a football match where two teams from different towns play each other and one side achieves victory over the other. The next day, newspapers will report on the same football game in different ways. The newspaper from the winning team's town will have a positive view of the events and will usually talk about how great their players' actions were. However, the newspaper from the losing side's town will be quite negative about the match and focus on the failures of their own players. So how can two newspapers provide different versions of the same event? The answer is perspective. They had a different point of view. Perspective works the same in history. Two opposing sides in a war, or in politics, or social struggles, will see exactly the same event in different ways. They'll describe it using different vocabulary. But please be aware, just because people have different perspectives and describe things in different ways, it doesn't automatically mean that one side is being honest and the other is lying. It just means that they have a different point of view. However, there may be occasions where a difference in perspective goes to the extreme and causes someone to lie or have an unfair view of people or events. That becomes bias, which is a different source analysis skill which we'll talk about in another video. So how do you determine a source's perspective? The first step in determining perspective is to know who the creator of the source was. Conduct some background research on who created the source and find out details about them. In doing so, you'll be able to understand how they viewed the past. So what kind of things are you looking for during your background research? First of all, you could be looking for their nationality, American, Japanese, etc. For example, in the First World War, British, German or Serbian soldiers would view the events of the war differently based upon their own nationality. You could also be looking for their social status. For example, are they a knight? Are they a soldier? Are they a peasant? For example, a medieval knight will see things very differently to a medieval peasant, even though they're from the same historical era. You could also be looking for their particular political persuasion. So are they conservative, liberal, communist, for example? You could also be looking for a particular cultural background. Are they European or American, or come from a very specific cultural group? You're also looking for different religious beliefs, Christian, Muslim, etc. For example, a Christian warrior during the Crusades would see events quite differently to a Muslim warrior at the same battle or location. And finally, you could also be looking for the creator's educational background. For example, what university they work for, because they might have a particular worldview. So now that you understand what perspective is and what details you're looking for in your background research, let's go through some examples and see how this affects sources. Most people have heard about Julius Caesar, a Roman politician and general. In his account of his wars in modern-day France, an area called Gaul to the Romans, he describes all of the things he does as a commander leading his troops and gaining political glory. So you could talk about, from a perspective point of view, the fact that he has a particular political persuasion. He is from a political group known as the Populares. You could also talk about him having a military perspective because he is a general. Or you could just talk generally about his cultural background, the fact that he is Roman. He may have a Roman perspective. Any of these options are perfectly valid ways to talk about Julius Caesar's perspective. One more example as well. When American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Japan in 1853 and 1854, the American soldiers that were with Perry saw him differently to the Japanese people he was meeting with. Compare this photo of Perry, taken by an American photographer, and see how he stands in a very militaristic way, very dominant. Now compare this to a painting made by the Japanese people of the time. You can see that it's almost demonic in his depiction of Matthew Perry, and this demonstrates the fear and distrust that the Japanese culture had of foreigners at the time. So understanding the different cultural perspectives of the Americans versus the Japanese at the time helps understand how they viewed their world. So now that you have a better understanding of what perspective means in regards to historical sources, I hope you feel more confident in your studies. If you need any further explanation.
All right, so I hope that you found that video helpful in understanding what perspectives really means, and also seeing the relationship between perspectives and source analysis, which I actually think is quite prominent. So although the author of this other article states that source analysis may not be the appropriate explanation for historical perspective, I think that we need to be analyzing sources in order to also be understanding perspective. So they kind of go together. And a lot of the skills do connect together. And you'll notice that in your teaching as well. But I guess the main point is that it's not easy to understand exactly what we need to do when we need to be identifying perspectives in source analysis. So it can be quite difficult to teach and to also understand as well. So when we are analyzing sources as a means of determining the perspective of the source, it involves both understanding the perspective through analysis. So we actually need to analyze the source and also interpret what is being said through the source. So this example here is for more upper secondary history students, but just to show you what is involved in source analysis, just an example. So think about using a certain photograph. So photographs are often used as a historical source. We're looking at the photograph here of Lenin, a Russian politician. So for example, what sort of things might we be doing when we're looking at a photograph? Well, we're deciding whether the source is a primary or secondary source. Okay, so students need to be doing that. They need to be able to do that. And we know that there are different types of sources that they're doing that with. So photographs, videos, speeches, paintings. We're also looking at, so for example, for the primary teachers, we looked at the use of toys. We're looking at toys from the past. Okay, so what grandparents and parents would have played with when they were younger. And students may be looking at different toys in the classroom and analyzing how they would have been used and coming up with questions that they'd like to ask maybe their own family members about whether they use those types of toys or how they were used and so forth. So if we think about photographs though, where students are using these as a source of information, there is certain criteria that we need to be going through. So it's kind of similar to what we do in English. Okay, so I've also taught high school English, and where students are actually looking at photographs or even scenes from films to analyze what the impression on the audience would be and the impact. All right, so what's the first thing that we're doing when we're analyzing photographs or any source really? We're looking at the purpose. So why was the source made? Why was it created? So common purposes might be pictures, would be to record a certain moment in time. A book might be to inform or persuade a group of people, or a speech by a politician would be thought of as being persuasive, okay, to persuade a group of people. We also need to think about the motive, so the reason for the source being made. So we're thinking of context, what was going on at the time, and connecting it to one's values and beliefs. Relevance, so how useful is the source in providing information about the chosen topic? Does it really give us enough information? Accuracy, this is something that we can't really always be sure about, but we can think about maybe its potential and how accurate it is. So to assess the accuracy, you can ask, was the creator of the source around at the time of the event being portrayed, because they were there in the moment? Can the information source be supported by other sources? So do we have other sources that can back up what we're finding in a particular source? And are there clues of bias that may say it's inaccurate? So if we go back to this example here, we can see that this one was written by a professor, so the accuracy is more than likely true. Okay, so students could probably say the potential for it to be accurate is likely quite high because it's written by a professor who is trained and in this area and in this topic. Okay, so this is something that students need to be doing, is actually asking a lot of questions about a source. Okay, and this is what they're doing from early stage 1 as well. Now, in this example here, which is something that students will be doing in English as well, they are actually analyzing what's happening in the picture. So for example, this source analysis here is saying the photograph of Lenin addressing a crowd shows him as the largest person in the image. So that has an impact right there. Okay, so him being in the foreground. It is clear that the photographer wanted the audience to focus on him. So everybody's looking at him, okay, in the background. And we can see a large number of people looking at him, which may show that the photographer wanted their audience to also admire Lenin, okay? So the purpose of and the reason for the photographer taking this photograph is what we're looking at here. Finally, the image was taken close up to Lenin, which makes him seem like a dominant figure. So therefore, it can be ascertained that the creator and the photographer of this photograph wanted the person looking at this picture to feel confronted by who Lenin was and what he was saying during the speech. So the dominant message of the photograph is that Lenin was a powerful speaker who was admired by all those who were watching him, and that his message was worth listening to. Okay, so another example, which was you'll recognize from part A of this lecture. Okay, so this is the landing of Captain Cook at Botany Bay by E. Phillips Fox. Okay, so these are the types of things that we're looking for when we're looking at sources. So who painted the painting? When was it painted? What type of source is it? So we're looking at its reliability. What is the meaning of the painting? From what point of view is the source created? What historical events were happening at the time that the painting was created? Who was the intended audience of the painting? For what purpose was the painting made? So the motive. Is this source useful in providing us with information about the event? So relevance, is it relevant to us? Is it useful? Okay, so usefulness and relevance coming together there. And how accurate is the painting in depicting the events? Okay, now remembering that source analysis is something that students are doing all of through their learning in history. So I'll just quickly share one more thing. This is something that many of you may have seen before, but this is just an example of something that students are doing in year 7. So this is something that students need to be able to do when they leave primary school, okay? So in terms of perspectives and source analysis. So they need to be able to examine sources and come up with questions, okay? So that's part of that skill of research. So if I just show you if I just show you the history syllabus, we know that in early stage 1, students are posing questions, okay? And they're doing that straight through, obviously up until stage 5, okay? So posing questions about the past is something that students need to be able to do. Okay, so, all right, so coming back to the exam. So students are analyzing sources, okay, asking questions that they would ask as a an archaeologist who had dug up these remains, okay? Now also source analysis, students need to be thinking about what type of historical source is pictured above. So is it a primary or a secondary? And also, what is the origin of source 5? Okay, so that question was actually a bit confusing for students because they weren't sure if they were looking at if they were being asked whether the origin of the photograph or the actual person who had created the shoe. So that was a bit confusing there. What is the purpose? So again, we're looking at purposes, okay? And different sources that students had to read through and to be able to understand, point of view and perspective, okay? So that's coming through. So what is the point of view presented here? So they had to read through this and determine what this person thought about Ötzi the Iceman's death, okay? And what happened to him before he died. Okay, just before we finish up, we're coming to the end of this lecture. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of websites that offer some information on how to embed Aboriginal perspectives into your teaching. This may be particularly helpful for those of you who may not have a full understanding of Australian history and may wish to learn more about Aboriginal perspectives. So I'll just show you what these websites are. Okay, so the first one is this one here. Okay, embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives through program and practice. So there's quite a bit of information there. Okay, some tips and some links, and there's this one as well, which is actually from the Queensland government, and it's a PDF. So what are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives? Defining them, rethinking them, and attitudes and perceptions, which is quite good. So I'll upload this as well for you to have a look at. One thing I did want to show you just before we finish off here is that the confusion, and this is one thing that the author actually draws attention to in the article. So this is where I got these links, is that in exams later on in secondary school, it's quite obvious that the idea of perspectives is quite confusing and what we're asking students to do. So this is an HSC exam, okay? So if we go down to okay, so this is source 1, okay? So a picture and also a written excerpt, a couple of excerpts. Now, if we go up to the question, this is the question that's associated with sources A and B. How useful would sources A and B be for historians studying the reasons for Allied victory and German collapse in World War I? In your answer, consider the perspectives provided by the two sources and the reliability of each one. So we can see some words there that we've been looking at in this lecture. Reliability, okay, considering the perspectives. So that means that in this answer, students would need to go back and look at those two sources and think, is that a reliable piece of information? What perspective is being shown here? Now, the interesting part is that the answers here that are given to teachers who are marking this, so this is where they're looking at both sources, okay? Possible answers for source A. It is the American government perspective. It is a propaganda poster, and it was designed to encourage preservation of resources in the USA in light of the German U-boat campaign. And the second one, the second source, students could possibly answer and say Hindenburg's perspective of Allied victory. And it is an extract from a post-war memoir. So when teachers are marking students on this answer, they are looking at how students are answering perspective in these ways. They're also looking at the reliability and usefulness. Those are two words that I've mentioned quite a bit in this lecture. So is it a reliable piece of source, and is it useful? Okay, so what do you think about the types of answers that are offered here for when students are commenting on the perspective of the sources? How do you think that aligns with what the author was saying of that article? You may wish to go back and have a look at that article. Do you think that that confusion of what students are being asked to do is coming through there, or do you think that perhaps it aligns quite well with what we want students to do? Please feel free to offer your opinion on that. All right, so going back to the lecture. And this is the part where those of you who are in the primary unit may wish to finish off, and that's fine, but you're welcome to continue on and listen to what else is being said here. All right, so the 3 chapters in the Sharp textbook are focusing on the cross-curriculum priority. So that's that cube that we looked at the beginning of the unit. So the focus of these chapters get you to have a think about how and where the teaching of these priorities appear in the secondary history curriculum. So there may be 1 or 2 of these priorities that you can see to be quite prominent in the syllabus, but perhaps there may be 1 or even 2 that you're just not too sure how that fits. So the first one being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. So I quite like a quote that's stated on page 209 of the chapter. And I'll just read it here. The inclusion of the cross-curriculum priority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures within teacher planning and praxis has not been proven to, in and of itself, improve student outcomes, reduce racism, or promote reconciliation. It's further mentioned that the topic seems isolating in the curriculum, that it's more of a mention than anything else, so that we're not doing enough about this cross-curriculum priority in secondary history. So as you go through that chapter, there's quite a bit of good information about this cross-curriculum priority, and talks a little bit about where that's looked at in the curriculum, and offers some websites for you to have a look at too, for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about embedding learning activities into your teaching. But I ask you in a poll question here, do you think we're doing enough with this cross-curriculum priority in the secondary curriculum? Now, if we look at Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, this is the one that gets the most criticism when I ask students, do you think any of these cross-curriculum priorities should be changed? This is the one that gets pointed out the most. A lot of students will question, why Asia? Why not another country? And even the chapter brings up this point as well. Why not all countries? Make it a global perspective. So the chapter states that geography and economics are the usual and easy answers given when asked why Asia. And the main reasons given by the author in the chapter, which is quite good, but why we include this as a cross-curriculum priority include economics. So we have a lot of trade with Asia, and Australia is said to be more prosperous because of our engagement with Asia. Security, so there's the argument that our own security in Australia will become more tied to Asia in the future. And cultural reasons, so Australia's culture can be enriched with more connection to Asia. So those are the points that the chapter brings up. So one of the criticisms raised in the chapter is about the reason for why it's included as a cross-curriculum priority, in particular in 2012. And it's stated in the chapter that this is attributed to instrumentalist economic gains. So there's also the argument that this cross-curriculum priority isn't present enough in the curriculum. So for example, if we look at years 7 to 12, it's quite Eurocentric, and also ancient history, it's not prominent. So I'll just, before I talk about sustainability, I'll just show you some examples from the textbook here. So this is taken from pages 238 to 240, and we can see that these are some areas where you can have opportunities to incorporate Asia into these different topics, okay? And there's also some examples here of the topics that are relevant to the Asia-Australia engagement in the curriculum. What's interesting is that some of these ideas here that are in the table are options. So popular culture, that may be an opportunity to incorporate Asia into the curriculum. However, not all schools actually have to study that. So that's another thing too. And migration experiences, it may not be an option. So I can kind of see that it may not be present enough. It's not required enough. If it's a cross-curriculum priority, but yet the opportunities are optional, that could be kind of problematic as well. So going back to sustainability. So to me, this is the least obvious connection to history. It's the one that I would think, really, sustainability and history, that's more geography, science, and so forth. Maybe even English, if we're looking at Aboriginal ways of connecting to the environment. But ACARA actually defines sustainability as, quote unquote, an ongoing capacity of an environment to maintain life, whereby the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So although it may be difficult to find this one in the syllabus, we are looking for topics that focus on the use of environmental resources. So for example, in year 8, and the chapter goes over this, students are looking at how Polynesian societies used environmental resources, and also that Vikings unit that I always talk about in year 8, the importance of farming. Even the Industrial Revolution, students could be looking at impacts of manufacturing on the environment. But again, in year 10, to focus on the globalizing world, there are options in there, and some of them may not exactly be looked at in a school. They may not even look at those units of work. So I'm hoping that you found those chapters quite good. I would like to invite you to consider whether, after reading these 3 chapters, do you feel that there are issues with any of these cross-curriculum priorities in the curriculum, whether that be that it's not present enough in the curriculum, that it's not present, and that's just a mention. That's one of the points and criticisms that was made about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. Or is there some other point that resonates with you about these cross-curriculum priorities in secondary history? Okay, so that's the end of this lecture for today. So I'm hoping that you've enjoyed listening to this and you've made the connection between part A and B of this lecture. So part A was really about just going over teaching from different perspectives, and part B was about really understanding what perspectives really means as a concept and as a skill, because it's there in the syllabus in both of those ways. So we need to know what it means. And if other teachers are confused about what it actually means and what it looks like in practice, then I think it's something that we need to talk about further, which is the purpose of this lecture. So I'm hoping that I've raised some good points about the topic of perspectives, and perhaps when you look at the syllabus, maybe you'll have some new ideas to be thinking about what the teaching of perspectives will look like in practice when you're actually in the classroom. All right, thanks everyone.